All right, so welcome to the presentation on the 2020 Middle Year Student Survey. I'm Nicholas Borodenko, a partner at PRA, and we've been conducting the CUSC survey now virtually since it started in around 1995 or so. So we're going to be walking through the results of the 2020 survey and talking a little bit about the 2021 survey. So the methodology for the 2020 survey, so this is the 26th cooperative survey conducted by CUSC. This year in the 2020 survey, there were 29 participating universities, which is up slightly from 2017 when there were 24, and from 2014 when there were 28, based on the 3-year CUSC survey cycle. This year, the survey was sent out to almost 72,000 students, yielding responses from over 20,000 with an overall response rate of 29%. What we've seen is that that response rate of 29% is pretty consistent year to year, plus or minus a few percentage points. But what we have seen is the floor, the lowest response rates, tend to be creeping up slightly. So typically we might see response rates in the past of 8 to 10% for some institutions, but you can see here the lowest from this past year was 16%. So the floor, so that sort of minimum response rate we're seeing is creeping up. And I think that has a lot to do with students using their email more often, which is typically the way we contact them. Also institutions advertising the survey more, but also to I think the incentives that institutions are using is helping to maintain or bring the floor up to those responses. All the data in the report has been weighted to match the size of the university population. So if a larger institution is only sampling a portion of their middle year students, so say for example, they're only surveying 1,000 students out of what might be a population of say 4, 5, 6,000. The data is weighted back to the size of those universities. So the fact that they're taking subpopulations when we're looking at results nationally and at a group level or at a university level, those data, all the data presented are weighted back. So looking at our profile of middle years students, about 2/3 of our participants are female, about 1/3 are male. I've been asked in the past, if we are over or underrepresenting either of the genders, and this gender data is based on what institutions provide in their sample files. And when you look at it at an aggregate form amongst all students, regardless of response rates, this is pretty close. It's about 65% female or 64% female, give or take a few percentage points. So this doesn't really under or overrepresent either gender very significantly at all. About 6% of our respondents in middle years have children. 39% identify as a member of a visible minority, and 86% are Canadian citizens. Of those who are non-Canadian citizens, 9% are international students and 5% are permanent residents. Although the average age of students is 22 years old, the median is a little bit closer to 21. And in fact, 71% of students in the sample file are under 22 years of age. So the vast majority are under 22. And given the fact that these are students in their second, potentially third or fourth years, we would generally not expect them to be that much older than 22 on average. 6% self-identify as Indigenous, and 14% self-identify as first-generation students. And first-generation students are students who neither parent went to any post-secondary. So be it college, be it university, they have no post-secondary education. We do see a difference here for the proportion of students who are first generation by their age. As students get older, they're more likely to be a first generation student. For example, 11% of students 19 and younger are first generation students compared to 27% of those 25 and older. We also do see another difference here amongst the size of institutions. So data is analyzed by the size of institutions, and institutions are grouped into 3 groups. Group 1 institutions are small undergraduate institutions. Group 2 institutions are medium-sized institutions. Typically, they will have some graduate programs, but do not have a law school or a medical school. And our Group 3 institutions are the largest institutions that will have both graduate programs, a medicine program, and a law program. So what we find is there are differences here by those who self-identify as visible minority. Those that are in Group 1 universities, so the smallest institutions, are less likely to have students who self-identify as visible minority than those in Group 2 and Group 3 institutions. So we asked some questions around disabilities, and so 30% of students identify that they have some sort of accessibility issue. The most common issue identified is mental health, so 19% of those who identify an issue, it's mental health. Other ones that are higher, 6% say that they have ADD or ADHD, 6% identify as a learning, and another 4% say they have a vision or a chronic condition. So though 30% identify an accessibility issue, just 9% say that their issue impacts them on a daily basis, and the highest being those with a mental health issue. So although 30% have some sort of accessibility, when we look at the sort of the day-to-day impacts, it's about 9%, about 1 in 10 students. Looking at living arrangements, 38% of students live with family, and another 40% live on campus. Among those who are currently not living on campus, about 1 in 5, so about 22% of students say they would live on campus if they were given the opportunity. Among those who are not currently living on campus, visible minority students are about twice as likely as non-visible minority students to say they would prefer to live on campus if given the chance. When we look at how they commute to and from school, it's sort of split between transit and using a vehicle. These vary significantly by the institution. Some institutions have, virtually almost all students driving. Others have very high use of public transit, but overall at a national scope, it's split fairly evenly between these. We do find some differences between students who identify as a visible minority versus those who do not. Visible minority students are more likely to use transportation, public transportation, 50% versus 35%, meaning they're also less likely to use a vehicle to get to and from school. And also some differences here in commuting by age. The older a student is, the more likely they are to drive to and from their institution and less likely to use public transportation or walk. So now looking at the academic profile of our middle year students, 86% are attending full-time. Another 20% say they have transferred from another institution prior to being at their current institution. And in terms of their grades, about a third say they have an A- or higher, of which probably at least 10% of those students are probably lying. When we look at, there are some differences here amongst the institutions, at least in terms of size. Group 3 students, so students at the largest institutions, are more likely to be studying full-time than students at Group 1 or Group 2 institutions. And the older a student is, the less likely they are to be studying full-time, and the more likely they are to say they have transferred from another institution. Looking at studying patterns. So we look at study patterns in terms of what students report in terms of how they are studying in and out of class. And so when we look at their hours in class, this averages around in class about 15 hours a week, but it sort of varies. See the biggest group is about a third in that 11 to 15 hour range. Then we look at our hours outside of class, their students tend to be doing slightly more work or less work. It's sort of this scale sort of skews. So either students are doing much less work outside of class or much more work outside of class. And then we look at these hours broken down. In total, it's about 31 hours a week students are spending on their academics, both in and out of class combined. We do find some differences here amongst various groups. There is a difference here by grades. Students spend their grades, the less time they spend on their academic activities in and out of class, the lower their grades. For example, students with an A- or higher spend about 18.5 hours on their academics outside of class versus about 14 hours for students with a C+ or lower. So there is a correlation there between grades and the hours they're spending on their academics. There also is some differences here by age. The older a student is, the less time they spend on their academics in class, again, because they're less likely to be attending full time. However, there's almost no difference in the hours they're spending outside of class. So although older students are spending less time in class, they're spending just as much time outside of class. So for example, for students who are 19 and younger, the ratio of hours in and out of class is about a 1-to-1 ratio. So they're spending about an hour outside of class versus an hour in. For students 25 and older, they're spending about, the ratio is about 1.3 to 1. So they're spending about 1.3 hours outside of class for every hour in class. So as students get older, they're spending more time relative to their in-class hours. Now looking at their activities, so what are our middle year students doing? This is based on students who say they have done this much or very much in the previous 12 months. So these vary a little bit, student clubs being the highest at 20%, down to all the way at 7% for student governments. It will be, of course, interesting to see at the 2021 survey how some of these activities are changing. Students also volunteer about a quarter, say they volunteer on or off campus. Amongst those who do volunteer, they average around 3.5 hours of volunteer time per week. Students' employment status. So at the time of the survey, about 56% say they are currently employed and they work about 16.5 or almost 17 hours per week. Amongst those, we also see that about 18% say they were also seeking work at the time of the survey. For those who are employed, we asked them the impact that their employment has on their education. About 16% say it's a positive impact on their education, 36% say it has no impact on their education, and 48% indicate that it has a negative impact on their education. There are differences here amongst a number of groups in terms of their employment. Students at smaller or the smallest institutions, so those group 1 institutions, although they're not more likely to be employed, they're more likely to, they work more hours on average in a week compared to students at middle-sized or larger institutions. Students who self-identify as a member of a visible minority, about twice as likely as non-visible minority students to say they are seeking work. So there's no difference in their employment, but amongst those who are not employed, they're about twice as likely to say they are seeking work. The older a student is, the more likely they are to be employed and the more hours they work per week. So again, there's that trade-off between going to school full-time. And we also find too that the lower the student's grade, the more hours they are working outside of class. So a student with a C+ or lower average works about 18 hours a week, whereas students with an A- or higher work about 15 hours a week. Now, looking at students' educational experiences and their perceptions of their professors. So in terms of performance, so there's around, if I remember correctly, 14 items we asked students to rate about their professors. Professors always grade out fairly highly. These ones here range from about 88 to 97% of students who say that they're good or very good. And then what we find is we also ask students those same 14 items and say, well, what are the most important things for professors to be focusing on? As you see here, there isn't a whole lot of overlap here. Only one of the top 5 in terms of performance actually links to one of the top 5 being most important. And we can see in terms of where these other ones rank in terms of being most important. So these tend to rank more towards the bottom in terms of performance. Communicating well is 8th, intellectually stimulating is 12th out of 14, that's towards the bottom. Fair in the grading falls just outside the top 5 in performance and well organized. And so the areas where students are rating professors highly is not necessarily the areas that they feel are most important. In terms of their ability to evaluate their teaching, so were they given the ability to evaluate their courses? 4% say they were able to evaluate none, 7% say some, 18% say most, and 71% say they were able to evaluate all of their courses. In terms of satisfaction with the quality of teaching, so 2% strongly disagree they're satisfied, 12% disagree they're satisfied, 71% agree, and 15% strongly agree. And we do find a difference here between students' grades. As students' grades decrease, their average grade decreases, they're less likely to strongly agree, or less likely to be satisfied with the quality of teaching. And so as their grades are lower, the quality of teaching is seen as being poor. In terms of growth and development, so we asked students how their institutions or how their universities have contributed to the growth and development of 29 different skills. And I'm going to show you, here's the top 5 skills in terms of the percent that have said much or very much contribution. So top 5, working independently, ability to find and use information, thinking logically and analytically, interacting with different people, and writing clearly and correctly. In terms of the bottom 5, in terms of contribution, math skills, appreciation of the arts, entrepreneurial skills, second or third language skills, and spirituality rank at the bottom 5. And these have consistently, those bottom 5 have been fairly consistent. This is a question that has not changed very much, at least over the getting close to 20 years I've been working on this project. Those bottom 5 skills tend to be in the bottom 5 consistently. We don't find, so we analyze all these results looking at differences between genders, and we do not find a lot of differences here between our male and female students. One of the only ones is a difference here in terms of contribution to math skills. Men are more likely than women to rate the university as contributing much or very much to their math skills. 43% of men compared to 25% of women. In terms of their commitment to completion, so their commitment to their university. And so in terms of those who agree or strongly agree, 94% say they're willing to put in a lot of effort into being successful, and 88% say they normally go to all of their classes, which is good. And the word normally go to all their classes means, yeah, I normally guess I go to all. Not sure how you normally go to all. 75% say they can deal with stress, and 71% say they have good study habits. We do find one other difference here by gender in terms of dealing with stress. Men are about almost twice as likely as women to say or strongly agree that they can deal with stress. About 29% of men say they can deal with stress, or strongly agree they can deal with stress, compared to 17% of women. There's also some differences here by grade amongst the having good study habits. 84% of those with an A- or higher say they have good study habits, compared to 70% of those with a B average, and 49% of those with a C+ average. And so at least students here are somewhat aware of the fact that their study habits do have an impact on their grades. Although I guess they could be looking at their grades and saying, well, my grades are good, I guess my study habits aren't great because they're not working. Chicken or the egg scenario. In terms of the perceptions of their education, 83% find most of their courses are interesting. 81% find their course load being manageable. 83% say they are in the right program for them. And 66% say they had adequate information about their program before enrolling in it. Now looking at their finances. So 68% agree that they have the finances to complete their programs. These are middle year students, so they're anywhere from potentially 1 to 3 years away from completing their program. So what we do is we look at here amongst those who agree or strongly disagree, looking at the variance in terms of how they said if they have the finances to complete the program, and looking at the average debt they have and the funding that they require to pay for their institution per year. So if we look at how much each of those groups say they require to pay for a year of education, which is a question we're going to talk about later on, those differences are pretty small, right? Amongst all those groups, the window, the average there is pretty similar. But what we find is when we look at the debt load of these students, this is where we start to see the differences. Those who are more likely to agree currently are carrying a lower debt load, and that debt load continues to go down the more they agree. And so really here that having the finances is not about the fact that students are paying a higher amount for a year of education. It's just how they are financing their education. Those who are taking on more debt are less sure that they're going to have the finances to complete their program, or potentially finances to them may mean, are they willing to take on the debt load that's going to be required for them to complete their program? In terms of university being worth the cost, so 58% agree that a university degree is worth the cost. You know, I know I've talked about this with a lot of institutional researchers and people at various institutions. This is one of those ones that, you know, is a very hard one for students to answer at the time. You know, we really don't start to see the value until we are, you know, graduated or out of our program for a few years. But at the time, you know, 58% say that's worth the cost. And looking at that same analysis again, looking at their funding per year and their debt loads, again, funding per year, pretty similar, you know, amongst the groups. There's a bit of an uptick amongst those who strongly agree. They're paying more for their current year of interest. But then when we look at debt loads, oops, I go this way, we look at debt loads, again, that group that strongly disagrees is carrying the highest debt load. You know, they're carrying about a 30% more in debt than those other groups. We don't see the same trend, or at least the same strength of trend as we did in terms of having finances to complete the program, but there is some relationship here to debt. So it's not just simply the current costs, as much as students are probably considering somewhat their future costs down the road. Now looking at their perceptions of persistence. So 89% plan to come back to their university next year, and 92% plan to complete their degree at universities. In terms of the number of times we've asked this question, there's always a slightly higher percentage who plan to complete their degree than plan to come back. So that means, you know, immediately there's, you know, about 3% of students, you know, 1 out of every 33 or so students who are going to be stopping, who plan to stop before fully completing their degree. The interesting part is, when we ask students if they plan to go to college next year or plan to transfer to another university, you know, there is some overlap here. So that's not 21%. We can't simply just add those two numbers together, because some students do say they're planning to do both, I guess, you know, hedging their bets of what they're going to do next year. But we do find that more students say they're planning to go to college next year than say they're planning to come back to university, right? That 11% are saying they're not coming back, yet 14% say they're planning to go to college. So there are some students indicating it is about 3% of students overall who say they're planning to come back, but also at the same time plan to go to college or transfer to another university next year. Meaning that, again, there's a group of students who are somewhat up in the air and undecided about next year, or at the very least, undecided of how to answer a survey. In terms of meeting expectations, so how the university is doing it, meeting their expectations, nice positive green and red down arrow. So the big group is those who say the university has met their expectations. About 2/3 of students say the university has met their expectations, whereas 19% say their expectations were exceeded and 17% say they fell short. So pretty evenly split on those higher and lower ends. We do find some differences here by grades. The higher the student grades, the more likely they are to say that their expectations have been exceeded. 28% of those with an A- or higher say their expectations have been exceeded, compared to those with with a C+ or lower. Just 12% say their expectations have been exceeded. Looking at overall evaluations, what's the satisfaction with their university? So in terms of being very satisfied with the decision to attend and the concern shown for them as an individual, in terms of the concern shown for them as an individual, skews a little bit positive. Around 2/3 are satisfied or very satisfied. And then in terms of their decision to attend the university, that's slightly higher. You're looking at almost 9 in 10 say they're satisfied with the decision to attend the university. Fairly similar numbers to those who are planning on coming back next year. We haven't actually analyzed the relationship between being satisfied with the university and decision to attend and decision on whether or not to come back. But my guess is, you know, you probably find a very high overlap between those who are dissatisfied and those who are probably not planning on coming back next year. So would they recommend their university? And so to answer this question, we use the Net Promoter Score question. So those who are unfamiliar, it's a question asked on an 11-point scale from 0 to 10. And what happens is individuals then are grouped into 3 different groups based on their answer. And so they're grouped into what are called promoters, passives, or detractors. And promoters are those who give a rating of 9 or 10 out of 10. Passives are a 7 and 8. And detractors are a 0 to 6. And this scale's used a lot in terms of brand commitment or organizational commitment. Works fairly well as a way to get a sense of how people are feeling about the brand. And what we find is about 27% are promoters, so those who rated a 9 or 10 out of 10. 45% are passives, so those are your 7s and 8s, and you've got another 28% are detractors. And so the way you calculate your net promoter score is you take your percentage of promoters, you subtract your detractors, and that is your net promoter score. So overall, at a national level for middle year students, we have a net promoter score of -1. That is, to be honest, not a great score. Typically, amongst graduates at the very least, or amongst the general public, you tend to see net promoter scores for institutions around, in post-secondary in Canada, around the +10 to +20 mark. Just for context, last year, in the CUSC survey of first-year students, the net promoter score was a +14. Now, institutions do change from year to year, so that can impact some of the results. But what we do find is there is a difference among institutions and their size. So the smallest institutions, so those group 1 institutions, have a net promoter score of +11. Group 2 institutions, so those sort of medium-sized institutions, have a net promoter score of -12. So I can't remember exactly what those numbers are, but 12% more detractors than promoters. And group 3 institutions, those largest institutions, have a net promoter score of +2. So we really see those small institutions, very high, very positive numbers, those middle institutions. And so for those who are joining us who participated in last year's CUSC survey, I always say, your marketing departments, first of all, love this question. And looking at your net promoter score, if it's positive, it's a good thing to talk about and show. Whereas if it's negative, not so much. Goal development, looking at students' goal development. So 92% say they have chosen their major, which is good given the fact we're now talking about middle year students. They're getting on in years. After they graduate, 28% expect to apply to a professional program, and about a third expect to apply to graduate school. At this time, about 32% say they have some specific career in mind, while about another third-ish have several careers in mind. And then when we talk more about employment in terms of the steps students feel that they have taken or are taking, in most cases here, most of the steps students are taking at this point tend to be what you might call less concrete steps. So talking to parents, talking to friends, talking to professors, those aren't really what you'd call concrete steps. The ones that are more about volunteering or attending an employment fair, working in your field, are about a third of students in each case. At this point, 5% indicate they have taken none of those steps mentioned above, and that's actually down. We asked this question on the first year student survey, and in first year, 9% say they have not taken any steps. So there's a slight shift from first years to middle years, but nothing super drastic. Now looking at facilities and services, so there's this is a set of questions I think that at the institutional level works very well for analysis. We asked students for their use and satisfaction with 26 different services. So at a national level, we start to see some trends, but of course at an institutional level, as you're analyzing your data, I think these become quite valuable. So in terms of what are the most used services on campus, the on-campus bookstore rates as the most used service. Of course, we'll see how that changes for 2021. 60% are using e-resources at the library, 58% using food services, 49% are using their online bookstore, and another 49% say they're using academic advising. We do see a lot of differences here amongst groups. The younger a student is, the more likely they are to say they use university residences, the more likely they are to use on-site athletic facilities. Visible minority students are less likely to say they use parking on campus. Again, if we remember back, it's also because they're less likely to be driving to campus. Students who also identify as visible minority are also more likely to use services for international students, not surprising. So in terms of their satisfaction with services, so those same 26 services, amongst those who you have used them, we ask them their satisfaction. And typically, we get very high levels of satisfaction at a national level, 80% or higher, with 2 exceptions. And if you've ever sat through one of these presentations or been in CUSC anyways, this is not new. It's food and it's parking. It's literally the same problems people have with virtually almost all services, is parking and food. With that being said, food services, if you go back historically, like if you start to go back and look at data from the CUSC surveys starting, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, food services was, in terms of satisfaction, was ranked infinitely lower. It was typically a satisfaction rating around where parking is now, around 40 to 45%. And it has slowly over time creeped up as institutions have put more focus on the variety, the quality of the food services on campus. Parking, has not changed over time. Satisfaction at 40% has not changed over time, and to be honest, probably never will change. Finances, although maybe it'll change for COVID. Satisfaction with parking, sure, super satisfied. Don't have to do it. Looking at credit cards, so 86% of middle year students say they have at least one credit card. Amongst them, 77% of those with the credit card say they do not carry a monthly balance, so they're paying it off each month or potentially not using it, which is why they're not carrying a balance. But for those who are carrying a balance, their average debt load is on their credit card is over $3,000. So $3,400 is what those who are not paying off their balance are carrying on their current months. We do also find a difference here by age. The older a student is, the higher the debt they are carrying on their credit cards. That increases almost eightfold from those 19 and younger up to those 25 and older. In terms of their debt, so 43% of students say they have any education-related debt, and that's broken down by these 4 categories. So government loans, loans from family, loans from banks or financial institutions, and from other sources. So you can see those numbers on the right clearly don't add up to 43%, but of course students can have debt from multiple sources. What we do find too is students in group 3, so the largest institutions, do tend to carry more debt on average than students from group 1 and group 2 institutions, primarily because they're more likely to rely on loans from financial institutions. Looking at our debt amounts, 23%, or not 23%, the average debt for students with debt is about $23,000. If you average that across all students, so with or without debt, the average debt is just under $10,000, but those just with debt is about $23,000. So looking at those same numbers by those 4 sources, the average debt from government loans is around $20,000, from family is just under 10, from financial institutions is just over 13, and from these other sources is around 6. Again, as age increases, the average debt load increases by about 3 times. The average debt load for students 19 and younger is around $6,000 compared to almost $19,000 for those 25 and older. And that's debt on average. That's not just looking at those with debt. In terms of how students finance their current year, so we've talked a little bit about this in some of the slides previously, but on average, students require around $17,000 to fund a single year of education. In terms of where that financing comes from, variety of sources. The highest sources are parents and family, from summer work, government loans and current work, and then scholarships. Those are the top 5, and I think there's 10 different sources of financing we ask students about. Now the average amount students carry from these varies widely. You can see they get much more from their parents and family in government loans on average than they do from their current or summer work or from scholarships. And we do see a number of differences here amongst a number of sources. Students who identify as a visible minority are less likely to say they rely on summer earnings. Only about 31% of students who are visible minorities say they rely on summer work or summer earnings compared to 56% of non-visible minority students. Of course, as students' grades increase, they're more likely to say they rely on university scholarships or financial awards. The older a student is, the less likely they are to rely on parents, and less likely from summer work and less likely from RESPs. And as students get older, they say they require more to fund a current year. So for those who are 19 and younger, they require about $15,000 to fund a single year, compared to those who are 25 and older, say they need about $22,000. And so we've known from various qualitative research that we've done that when we ask students about what they're considering for funding a current year, varies. Some students specifically think about it as, tuition and textbooks. Others will go more widely and say, well, here's my cost of transportation. Here's my cost for food if I'm having to eat on campus. Others will say, well, here's the debt I'm taking on. So the interest on my debt is what I'm having to pay off. If I'm taking student loans, if my mortgage, like lots of different things some students will consider in terms of financing, which is why we see why older students report they need more to fund their education. Because remember, the older a student is, the less likely they are to be attending full time. So those two things aren't necessarily in sync. So those are all the results from this year. And to show one piece of analysis we did, and so we wanted to look at the impacts of COVID-19. And so the CUSC survey runs from the second week of January to the second week of April. And so clearly around the middle of March, we start to see the impacts of COVID-19. And we wanted to look at to see what was happening for those institutions who had started their survey in and around when the impacts of COVID-19 were starting to be felt. And so there were 3 of the 29 institutions that had at least 25% of their responses that came after March 15th, which is sort of what we used as the guideline for when we sort of thought the impacts of COVID. It was around the time that a lot of institutions had switched to or were switching to online learning. And so there were 3 institutions, and this is the percent that happened of their responses that happened after March 15th. And so we wanted to make sure we had institutions that had a robust sample. For those, there was one institution that started entirely after COVID-19, and it's hard to assess the impacts of that because differences between their answers and answers from other institutions, it's hard to tell if those are COVID related or if those are simply just nuances of that institution. So what we did is we did analyses comparing results for these institutions, each institution separately, so each of those 3 institutions, looking at the results pre and post March 15th. And we looked at, give or take, around 25 different questions on the survey, looking at questions we thought would be most impacted by COVID-19. So perceptions of professors, their commitment to return to the university, whether or not they'd recommend their university. We didn't look at things like employment and financing and things because those things shouldn't be drastically. Employment, of course, could be impacted, but we wanted to look at things at the institutional level that might be impacted. And what we found is really there were almost no differences between results. Actually, 2 of those 3 institutions, there was no statistical differences between results pre and post March 15th. And there was only one of those institutions, the one with 37% complete after March 15th, that we actually found a difference. And there was only two significant differences. So what we found is professors seem knowledgeable. That dropped from strongly agree from 46% to 30%. And professors are fair, the strongly disagree increased from 1% to 6%. That's it. The only 2 statistically significant changes from pre and post COVID, 1 institution, 2 questions, and to be honest, not hugely drastic changes. The professors seeming knowledgeable, a 46 to 30% drop, the thing is something worth noting, but it's not like it dropped from 46% to 2%. It dropped by about a third. So we thought, okay, well, maybe March 15th wasn't the best cutoff date. Like maybe students, March 16th, it's not like they had seen drastic changes. So I wanted to maybe see if we change the date. So if we said, let's move the date back a week, let's change it now to see if there's a difference if we allow students maybe some time to be impacted by COVID. And we found, again, only 2 differences for that same institution. So professors seem knowledgeable, still dropped. Drop wasn't quite as big as before, but of interest, the result for professors looking out for student interest actually increased from 15% to 25%. So students post-COVID impacts I guess, started to see that the professors were looking out for students' interests. They were doing things to ensure that the impacts of COVID were not being felt by students to a significant degree. But again, at the end of the day, the impacts of COVID on this very small scale in the few weeks that it would have been impacting didn't seem to have a lot to do with results. So when people are analyzing their data at a national level, I don't think there's much people need to do or answer for in terms of analyzing their results about the impacts of COVID. And at institutions that had data that sort of spanned that COVID impact, I think, clearly you can analyze the data yourself, but these sort of preliminary analysis sort of indicate that the impacts of COVID did not have significant changes on students, because to be fair, the impacts probably weren't really seen that quickly, and students probably had not had enough time to sort of digest them and think about them in a way that they may have seen. If you ask these questions, say at the end of April, once students have sort of gotten through their exam period and stuff, there may be different, but at this point, the impacts of COVID were quite small. So that is the presentation. I got a few more things to talk about, but I think now I'll open it up if there were any questions.
So as a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it into chat, or you can type "I would like to speak" into chat, and I'll unmute you.
But as I said, don't go away. There's still more to this presentation. Not about the results, but I feel like now is the time to. People ask questions about the results if they have questions. I didn't want everyone to start just ending their meeting before we.
Well, we did lose somebody. It went from 62 to 61. So.
It's probably a board member. Well, while people are typing in their questions and thinking about questions, because I put everyone on the spot now, I will talk a little bit about what is happening for next year, for 2021. So 2021 is the graduating student survey, which I think of all the three surveys is by far the most popular one. So I recommend that institutions get on board if need be. I think, if anything, I know I personally am super interested in some of these results are going to look like with the impacts of COVID, both in terms of satisfaction, but also there's a significant section in terms of graduate outcomes related to employment. I'm interested to see, what is happening with employment outcomes. Interested to see what students are indicating and saying around use and satisfaction with services. So I think a lot of really interesting aspects are going to be coming. Financing, lots of interesting aspects in the 2021 survey. Comparability over time going to be a little bit difficult, of course, but I think you need, to me, I think you sort of need this data to see what's going on with students. There also is going to be a model, a short optional model related to questions around COVID-19. So this will be included in the master data file for institutions that participate. So it'll be an optional set of questions. So you can opt in to having these questions asked, and any institutions that opt in, that data will be shared amongst those institutions. And the 2020 CUSC AGM, of course, is typically this is held during the SERPA conference, but without a in-person SERPA conference happening. The AGM will be virtual this year, and the date will be announced coming up in the early fall, so so people can put that into their calendar. I'm too always lecturing on this thing, and so I always say students, but we're not students. All right, now let's see. Will the recording, the questions are about will the recording be posted? Yes, you can listen to my voice as many times as you want. Let's make this go viral. Like, let's YouTube this, and
yeah.
If we can we do it on TikTok? Can we just break this down to like 30 seconds and then my kids can see it somehow?
That's right. We'll put some filters on it too, so you're wearing, a clown hat.
Yeah.
There's a question about will the Tableau file be available? Yes, I'm about to do a little bit of a demo of that. I believe, and we're sort of aiming for early September for the release of the Tableau materials. We'll post the video to our website, and we're also going to make the slides available at that same point. So there's going to be a little bit of post-processing on that video, so that'll take me a while. I have no idea why we put all the work for this webinar just before the term starts, when it's really busy. Those are the only questions I've seen.
Sure, we can, if you do want to flip over to your Tableau presentation, yeah, I will stop sharing this.
Move right over there, and through the magic here. Nicholas, can you give me a bit of a nod if you can see that, if that's come through?
Yep.
Okay, good. So here you can see a penultimate draft of our Tableau workbook. There's two things that we are delivering that are Tableau related. The first is this prepackaged workbook. The second is a saved data source, so that you will get the master data set in a form where you can roll your own Tableau workbook. So you'll be able to do that. But we put in some effort to do the results. Now, this one is slightly modified because if you've read, as I assume you all have, the CUSC data sharing agreement, you know that we don't share individual institution information. So I've had to disguise institutions in this a little bit. So we have a section on demographics, which is kind of what you'd expect it to be, that it's the thing on how many responses we got. There are filters along the side, and you can have different dimensions of demographics that you look at. One is the survey year. It is our intention to put in multiple years so that you'll be able to do your own longitudinal studies of the results. You can also filter by province or by individual university. I'm sure you all recognize your names in that list. So you can do your comparisons with ad hoc groups, or you could compare by your provincial group. And here you can see you can switch to citizenship information, or you can look at parents' highest level of education, and you can look at all that. There is a filter for weighting the results. As Nicholas pointed out at the beginning of his presentation, we do weight the results so that the results are reflective at the national level. But once you get down to comparing individual institutions against one another, so you're down to your, the people you really want to do better than, then you probably want to turn that off so that you are just looking at the raw values for each institution. So that filter exists on all these boards. So that's the demographics section. Then we have the overall percentages and frequency tables. It's very similar to the demographic section, except that you have the survey section here, which has the different categories of questions within the survey. So those are all the big headers there. And by choosing different parts of that, let's look at commitment to completion. Then it changes what questions are available to be reviewed. So if I'll just pick the first question here. This is the level of agreement. I have the financial resources to complete my program. And this is breaking it down here by parents' highest level of education. It remembers that dimension here. This might be one that is more interesting to look at by all the universities. There's a whole bunch here. Perhaps I don't care about all of you, but maybe I only care about Alberta respondents, so I can filter it down to just the Alberta respondents. Maybe I don't really want all the Alberta respondents, so then I can go in and I can take out individual institutions to get that down to just exactly what I want to compare as far as institutions go. So you can choose it that way. You can also choose it against a bunch of other dimensions, age groups, citizenship, course load, gender, all of those things where there seem to be potential for differences in response rates. Because it's slightly trickier, we've broken out debt levels by source into its own dashboard here. So again, you have all of the same filters and then the ability to put things against a different dimension. So for instance, here we have repayable debt from government student loans and broken into the different age categories, where you can see some of the things that Nicholas pointed that out, but you can filter this down to just the comparison set that you want. And because it's debt, we also allow you to filter it down. Maybe you're only really interested in government debt or parental debt. Maybe the demand on the family is coming back to you as negative feedback. So you can take a look at your information that way. We also have expected income. It's very similar to the debt, and that you can filter by types of income in that, and then you can see the various bits of work. And then my favorite, or maybe not, this is the Net Promoter Score, which you can do by different dimensions. The perhaps dangerous one is to select all of the institutions, and you will see that there is a shocking range of results by institution in here. There are some institutions where I need to contact you and figure out what on earth you're doing, because you're getting huge Net Promoter Scores. Anything up in the close to 40% is really an excellent score. And there are others of you who may want to also call that institution, because that's not the way it's turning out for your particular institution. So this does give you the ability to explore through that particular question. We also have some notes on the data that we've included in here. It's really just text to tell you some information about the data, reminding you about the groupings and the weighting, and noting particularly that the beauty of Tableau is you can drill into your data, and the hazard of Tableau is you can get right down to very small ends, where your reliability of that data becomes a little more suspect. We also include the data licensing agreement. I realize that's a little tiny type, but it has to have small print somewhere. So this tells you what you can do, because these products are subject to the data licensing agreement. They are not publicly releasable, because this is other institutions' data. And so as a member of CUSC, you are not to release other institutions' data. This is really intended for your internal planning. You are permitted to release your own data. You're just not allowed to do it comparatively. So that means you have the legal text in that agreement to slap the hands of your marketing department as you might need to. So I would be happy to take any questions that you might have on that. And I'll just end my sharing so I can see any questions. Sammy has asked if there's a simple way to filter out "don't know" to get the graphs for the valid responses. You can do that in Tableau by right-clicking on any response value and choosing to exclude it. So that it is possible to take those out individually. It creates a bit of a hidden filter though, so it's you have to reload your table to be able to undo those very easily. So that is possible. Are there any other questions? We've got a whole 5 minutes. I can stand here and wait. All right, well, I'm not seeing further questions in the chat. Oh, there we go. One quick question. Non-member institutions do not receive the master data file, and therefore they will not receive the Tableau products. And that's because the key to being able to get the other institutions' information is that data licensing agreement, which members agree to. So there's your incentive to participate as a member. Is it does give you all of that comparative data. So sadly, you won't be able to get the Tableau stuff. Oh, another question. We have not at this point produced workbooks or data files just for the individual institution. That is something we can consider for the future, but our task this year was to get this product launched with the national data set. The model could be applied to individual institutions.
Yeah, I would also say if an individual institution that was a non-member wanted that tableau just for them, like just with, of course, only with their own data in it, it can be done. And so you could contact the CUSC board to ask for a pricing model on that, because it's, yeah, because the tableau data set right now is only for member institutions. So to create an individual one for a non-member one, which can be done, there would just be a cost associated with that.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that, then just send an email to admin@CUSC-CCREU.ca. That's our project manager, and he'll take it to the board, and we'll come up with a price, and you can see if you want to do that. All right, well, I think we are getting to the end of things here. Thank you all for participating. This is by far the highest number of participants we've ever had in our webinar, with over 60 people. So have a good day, and do look for communications about our AGM and registration in next year's survey. Thanks.